Why was everyone laughing at her? The echoes filled the cavernous training hall, low, rumbling, and cruel. It wasn't the kind of laughter shared among friends or soldiers who respected one another. It was the sound of disbelief, the kind that tastes like mockery. Captain Eva Rostova didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, a quiet figure in a sea of broad-shouldered Marines. The gray mats beneath her boots smelled faintly of disinfectant and old blood. A chill draft cut across the room, fluttering the corners of tattered posters that barked phrases like, "Pain is weakness leaving the body." The Marines believed in that phrase. They lived by it. And right now, they believed she didn't belong here. Across the hall, Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, known simply as Gunny, paced like a restless predator. His voice was gravel and thunder. "Ma'am," he said, drawing out the word until it stung. "With all due respect, this is the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program. We break bones here, not code." Another wave of laughter rippled through the platoon. Eva's face didn't move. She didn't roll her eyes or tighten her jaw. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable behind a pair of thin-framed glasses. Her hands rested loose at her sides, not defensive, not submissive, just still. From the far corner, Colonel Vance, a man built from equal parts discipline and history, observed in silence. He saw something the others didn't. The subtle way she balanced her weight. The control in her breathing. The deliberate stillness of someone trained to act only when necessary. The laughter continued, bouncing off cinder-block walls. It wasn't just mockery, it was ritual. The Marines were protecting their temple. The cauldron. That's what they called this place. Every mark on the mat, every dent in the lockers, every sweat stain baked into the floor, it all told a story of transformation through pain. It was their holy ground, and to them, Eva Rostova, an Air Force cyber warfare officer, was an intruder. Gunny's boots struck the floor with deliberate weight as he spoke, circling the formation like a wolf among his pack. "You see, Marines," he barked, throwing a glance her way, "our friends from the Air Force fight a different kind of war. Their biggest injury is carpal tunnel. Their toughest battle is when the Wi-Fi drops." The platoon erupted again. But Eva wasn't listening, not really. Her eyes, sharp, calm, almost analytical, scanned the room, the subtle limp in one Marine's leg, the uneven stance of another, a smudge of blood on a mat corner that hadn't been cleaned properly. She wasn't judging them. She was observing them, the way a strategist studies the field before a move. Gunny Sullivan saw her silence and mistook it for fear. That was his mistake. "Captain," he said, walking directly up to her now, his shadow stretching across her boots, "since you're here to learn, let's give you the full experience." The room went quiet. He pointed toward a muscular corporal near the front. "Davis, step forward." The Marine obeyed immediately, broad chest, confident stride, the kind of man who'd been told his whole life that strength was enough. "Captain," Gunny said, his tone almost playful now, "show us a basic block encounter." He grinned. "Don't worry, Davis will go easy on you." The laughter that followed was quieter this time, tinged with anticipation. They wanted to see what would happen next. They wanted confirmation that their assumptions were right. But Eva didn't answer. Instead, she reached up and with calm precision removed her glasses. The metallic click of the case closing echoed in the stillness. She slipped it neatly into her pocket. Then she took a single step back, her boots whispering against the mat. Her stance changed, not wide, not tight, just balanced. Like she'd rooted herself to the ground. Her hands rose, open palms, relaxed fingers, not a Marine stance, not boxing, not karate. Something else, something older. Colonel Vance's brow furrowed. He recognized it, though only barely. Systema, Russian combat discipline. Efficient, fluid, devastating. "Go ahead, Corporal," Gunny said, waving Davis forward. "Let's demonstrate reality." The Marine lunged, a perfect explosive punch aimed straight at her chest. It never landed. Eva moved not fast, not forceful, just precise. She shifted her weight half an inch, sidestepped his momentum, and placed one hand gently on his elbow, the other behind his neck. For a heartbeat, it looked almost like a dance, graceful, quiet, inevitable. Then she pivoted. Davis's body left the ground. A flash of shock crossed his face before gravity reclaimed him, slamming him flat onto the mat with a heavy thud. The sound silenced the room. No one spoke. Even the ventilation hum felt deafening. Eva didn't smile. She didn't even breathe differently. She simply adjusted her stance as if nothing had happened. Gunny's expression hardened. His pride had taken a hit, and he wasn't ready to let it go. "Luck," he said hoarsely. "That was luck. 2 more get up here." 2 Marines approached, slower than before. The confidence in their steps faltered slightly. They moved to flank her. The first threw a looping right hook. The second dove low, aiming for her legs. She stepped in between them. Not back in. Her shoulder crashed into one man's ribs, using his body as a shield as the other's tackle missed its mark. The 2 collided. Before they could recover, she struck one precise chop to the base of a skull, one twist of an elbow joint. Both men were down before the others could blink. 3 Marines, neutralized. Now the laughter was gone. Only the sound of heavy breathing, disbelief, and the faint squeak of rubber soles on the mat. Gunny Sullivan's jaw clenched. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was angry. Angry that this quiet woman who said almost nothing was dismantling everything he thought he knew about strength. He motioned for the rest. "All of you, let's go." 7 more Marines, 10 in total. They surrounded her like a tightening circle. Every muscle, every instinct told them they were hunters, that this was just an anomaly. But she was the calm in the center. Still controlled, ready. The first 2 attacked in unison, high and low. She stepped forward, not back. One kick to a knee joint, one palm strike to a chin. 2 men fell. She flowed into the next movement, sliding between bodies, using each Marine's momentum against him. A thumb to a nerve cluster. An elbow from the hips. A sweep that dropped another to the ground. Every motion was deliberate, minimal, final. No grunts, no wasted effort. Just physics and precision. The last 2 hesitated. That was all it took. She closed the distance, silent, surgical, and they were both on the floor, one gasping from a chokehold, the other tapping out, wrist twisted to the edge of breaking. Then there was silence. 10 Marines lay scattered around her, groaning, breathless, humbled. Eva stood in the middle of them, still calm, still breathing evenly. She retrieved her glasses, slid them on, and turned toward Gunny Sullivan. Her gaze met his, not gloating, not challenging, just steady. The room, the cauldron, had changed. It wasn't filled with laughter anymore. It was filled with something else, respect and maybe a little fear. Colonel Vance stepped forward. The click of his polished boots echoed like judgment. He didn't look at the Marines. He didn't even look at Sullivan. He looked at Eva. "Captain," he said quietly, "state your full name and designate her for the record." She blinked once. "Captain Eva Rostova, 17S, Cyber Warfare Operations Officer, United States Air Force, sir." The colonel nodded, pulled a tablet from his belt. His fingers tapped the screen, a few seconds of silence. Then he handed it to Gunny Sullivan. "Read it," he said. Gunny took it, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes scanned the text, and the color drained from his face. He read aloud, voice cracking. "Name Rostova Eva. Rank Captain USAF. Primary MOS. 17S Cyber Warfare Secondary." He paused, his lips moved without sound. Colonel Vance's voice was steel. "Read the list, Gunnery Sergeant." Sullivan swallowed hard. "Graduate U.S. Army Ranger School. Graduate, U.S. Navy SEAL Underwater Demolition Program. Advanced Close Quarters Combat Instructor, Fort Bragg. Advisor, Israeli Defense Forces Krav Maga Special Cadre. He stopped again. The silence was suffocating. Vance's tone lowered to a cold edge. Continue. Mission history classified. Additional assignments redacted. He stopped reading. His eyes stayed on the screen as if searching for some mistake, some explanation that made this possible. But there wasn't one. Eva Ristova wasn't a desk officer. She was a ghost, a hybrid, a cyber operative who'd seen the battlefield up close. Vance took back the tablet, his expression unreadable. Then, in front of every Marine in the room, he straightened his back and saluted her. The sound of that salute, crisp, echoing, was louder than any applause could ever be. "Ma'am," he said, his tone rich with respect, "my apologies for my NCO's lack of professionalism. It will not happen again." For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. The laughter that had filled the cauldron minutes ago was now just a ghost in the air, faint, embarrassing, forgotten. And standing there, surrounded by silence, Eva didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded once, calm and steady. Because dignity doesn't speak. It acts. How long does silence last after humiliation? In the cauldron, it lasted exactly 11 heartbeats. Then someone exhaled, a sharp, involuntary sound that broke the spell. The Marines stood frozen, their faces a study in disbelief. Just minutes earlier, they'd laughed loud, confident, untouchable. Now they stood among their fallen brothers, their pride cracked like old glass. Captain Eva Ristova didn't move. She waited, composed, unshaken, as Colonel Vance's salute lingered in the air like a verdict. Then she simply nodded, turned, and walked off the mat. Her boots made no sound. Gunny Sullivan's jaw flexed, the weight of his own arrogance pressing hard against his chest. He felt every eye in the room on him, burning holes through his reputation. For years, his word had been law here. His voice, the authority that shaped Marines into warriors. But today, that voice had betrayed him. "Dismissed," he croaked, the word hollow, stripped of power. No one moved at first. Then slowly, the platoon broke formation, men helping each other up, shoulders bruised, egos shattered. They avoided his gaze, uncertain whether to pity him or fear him. Gunny stood alone. Colonel Vance turned to him, voice low and deliberate. "Gunnery Sergeant, my office, now." The words weren't loud, but they might as well have been a thunderclap. Sullivan nodded, throat dry. "Aye, sir." Eva didn't look back. She was already gone, her quiet footsteps fading down the long concrete corridor. The colonel's office was small, bare, and cold. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and the smell of strong coffee that had been sitting too long. Vance didn't sit right away. He stared out the narrow window that overlooked the training field, the same field where hundreds of Marines had bled, learned, and grown under Sullivan's command. Finally, he spoke. "You embarrassed this corps today." Sullivan's back straightened automatically, instinctively. "Yes, sir." "You humiliated a superior officer. You made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice." Sullivan said nothing. He couldn't. Every word would only dig deeper. Vance turned, his eyes cutting through him. "Do you know who that woman is, Gunny?" "I do now, sir." "No, I don't think you do." Vance's tone softened, not in mercy, but in precision. "She's one of the few who moves between worlds, between the digital and the physical, between code and combat. She doesn't need to prove anything to you or anyone in this building. And yet she did, because you couldn't see past your own shadow." Sullivan nodded once. "Understood, sir." Vance leaned forward, voice quieter now. "You talk about warrior spirit, Gunny, discipline, respect. You failed every one of those principles today. You wanted to teach your Marines a lesson in strength, but it was you who got taught." The words hit hard, not like bullets but like truth. And truth always hits deeper. When Vance dismissed him, Sullivan didn't go home. He walked back into the empty cauldron. The mats were still warm from the fight, the air still heavy with the echoes of what had just happened. He stood there for a long time, in the center of the same floor where he'd been humiliated, and stared at the scuffs left by her boots. That's when it hit him. It wasn't her skill that had shattered him. It was her control, her silence, the absolute absence of ego. For the first time in years, Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, the man who thought he knew what strength looked like, felt small, and that smallness was necessary. Meanwhile, Eva sat alone in the secure facility across the base. Her world was different, quieter, more clinical. Screens glowed with lines of code, maps of digital networks, and the invisible geography of modern warfare. She was back in her element, the realm where battle was fought not with rifles or knives, but with algorithms and deception. But even here, her mind drifted back to the cauldron. Not to the laughter, not even to the fight. To the looks on their faces afterward, that moment when arrogance cracked into realization. She'd seen that look before. In Afghanistan. In Syria. In places that didn't officially exist. People always underestimated her. Too quiet, too small, too analytical. They didn't understand that the most dangerous people in the world were often the calmest ones. The ones who didn't need to shout, didn't crave attention, didn't announce what they could do. Her father had told her that once back in Novosibirsk, long before she joined the U.S. Air Force. He'd been an instructor too, though his lessons were quieter. He used to say, silence is not absence, it's power waiting to be measured. She never forgot that. 2 days passed before Gunny Sullivan showed up at the secure building where she worked. He wasn't in uniform for intimidation this time. No swagger, no smirk, just fatigue etched into his face and humility in his eyes. He waited outside the restricted entry until she emerged, a stack of reports in hand. "Captain," he said quietly. She looked up, not surprised, not hostile either, just patient. "Gunny," she said simply. "I owe you an apology," he began, "for everything I said, for what I assumed." He paused, searching for words that didn't sound rehearsed. "I was ignorant, and I was wrong." Eva said nothing. He continued, voice tight. "What you did in that room, I've never seen anything like it. I've been teaching my Marines for 15 years. Thought I was preparing them for war. Turns out," he shook his head, "I was preparing them for the last one." Her gaze softened slightly, not pity, but recognition. She understood that look, the look of someone who just realized the world had changed without him noticing. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I'm asking for a chance to learn. Teach me. Teach them, please." For a moment, the air between them was still. Then Eva nodded once. "The first lesson is free," she said. "Assumptions are a liability. True strength respects all forms of competence." It wasn't just a clever phrase. It was doctrine. That evening, she walked back into the cauldron, not as a guest this time, but as an instructor. The atmosphere was different. The same Marines who had once laughed now stood at attention, eyes sharp, respectful. Gunny Sullivan barked, "Attention on deck." She shook her head slightly. "At ease," she said. "We're not here for ceremony." Her voice was calm, even. The same voice that had dismantled 10 men without a hint of anger. "Today," she began, "you'll forget what you think you know about fighting. You'll learn to see differently." The Marines listened, really listened, as she spoke. Her teaching was unlike anything they'd known. She didn't talk about strength or aggression. She talked about awareness, timing, psychology, about reading intent before motion. Her words came in short, precise beats. "Every fight has rhythm. Learn it. Force isn't power, control is. Respect isn't given, it's demonstrated." And then she showed them. Not fancy, not cinematic, but devastatingly efficient. Each move was a sentence, each motion a truth. She corrected stances with the gentlest touch, a shift of the wrist, a nudge of the foot. Efficiency, she murmured, is elegance under pressure. The Marines drilled for hours, sweat dripping, minds rewiring. Gunny Sullivan was among them, her most attentive student. Every time she threw him, he grunted, got up, and asked to see it again. He wasn't fighting her now, he was learning from her. And somewhere in that transformation, from pride to humility, the cauldron itself began to change. They called the center of the mat Ristova's Circle, a place where arrogance died and awareness began. Late that night, long after the others had gone, Sullivan lingered again. He stared at the mat, the scuff marks illuminated by the faint blue of emergency lights. He remembered the first time he'd stood here, laughing, mocking, blind. Now he stood in silence. He wasn't ashamed anymore, he was grateful. Because sometimes the hardest thing a soldier can do is unlearn. In the corner of the room, Eva closed her duffel, preparing to leave. "Gunny," she said softly. He looked up. "Don't thank me," she added, "just pass it forward." He nodded, understanding completely. When she walked out, the door clicked shut behind her, and in that sound something changed forever. The cauldron wasn't just a place of muscle and bruises anymore. It had become a place of awareness. And for the first time in years, Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan smiled, not the grin of arrogance, but the quiet smile of a man who'd finally learned what strength really meant. How fast can a story travel through a military base? By the next sunrise, it had already outrun truth. In the chow line, in the barracks, in the armory, whispers followed every Marine who had been inside the cauldron that day. The story changed with each telling. Some said she moved faster than they could blink. Others claimed she'd broken bones with a single touch. A few even swore she'd taken down 12 men, not 10. But no matter how the details bent, the core remained unshakable. An Air Force officer, quiet, small, and calm, had walked into the Marine Corps, temple of toughness, and rewritten the definition of strength. They started calling her the Ghost, others called her the Librarian, but to most, she was simply Ristova, a name spoken with a strange mixture of awe and discomfort. Even those who hadn't seen her fight felt as though they had. The myth painted itself into memory. It became the unspoken lesson every recruit heard before stepping onto the mat. Don't underestimate anyone, especially the quiet ones. And somewhere in the midst of all the talk, the laughter on base stopped sounding the same. Captain Eva Rostova didn't hear any of it directly. She didn't want to. Her days fell back into rhythm, code reviews, intelligence briefings, late nights surrounded by glowing screens and soft static. She returned to her element, a silent strategist in the war no one saw. But even as she worked, the memory of that training hall followed her like a faint hum. Not pride, not vindication, something quieter. She'd been underestimated before by insurgents, by officers, by the system itself. But that day, for the first time, she hadn't had to prove anything with words. Her actions had spoken a universal language. Yet the incident had left something unresolved. Because behind every myth, there are those who carry shame. Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan walked differently now. The swagger was gone, replaced by a slower, steadier rhythm. The Marines who had once mirrored his arrogance now mirrored his silence. He still commanded with power, but it came from a different source. Less bark, more precision. His tone had changed, his eyes too. He didn't know how to explain it to the other instructors, how one quiet woman had dismantled a lifetime of certainty in under a minute. But he didn't need to. Every day he trained his men, the lesson replayed itself. Sometimes, when recruits stepped onto the mat too confident, too loud, he would simply say, "You ever hear of Ristova's Circle?" The recruits would glance down, puzzled. And then he would nod to the faded spot in the center of the room, the patch of mat where she'd stood. "That's where arrogance comes to die," he'd say softly. The phrase stuck. 2 weeks later, Eva's temporary assignment neared its end. She had spent her evenings teaching not just fighting but perception, the art of seeing what others missed. She taught Marines to measure distance not in feet but in time, to read intent from shoulders, not eyes, to listen for silence as much as for motion. Each night the cauldron filled with the rhythm of controlled impact, grunts, shuffles, soft thuds, and under it all something sacred was forming. Gunny Sullivan had become her most devoted student. He studied every movement with an intensity that bordered on reverence. She corrected his form once, just a small adjustment of the wrist. "Don't force it," she told him quietly. "Guide it." He'd nodded, repeating the motion until it became second nature. That was how humility felt when worn by a Marine, not weakness but refinement. Outside, the late Virginia sun cast gold across the base. The trees rustled with wind off the Potomac. It was peaceful, deceptively so. Inside the secure facility, Eva packed her duffel. Orders had come in that morning. Her presence was required back at Langley for a new phase of Operation Chimera. Another mission, another shadow. She folded her uniform with precision, every crease sharp, every motion deliberate. The ritual of someone who needed order to contain memory. But something in her chest tightened, not sadness exactly, more like awareness, the kind that precedes change. The knock came just as she zipped the bag shut. "Enter," she said. The door opened, and there he was, Gunny Sullivan, posture straight, uniform crisp. But the arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like gratitude. "Ma'am," he said. She turned, "Gunny." He stepped forward, stopping just short of attention. "Before you go, I wanted to say thank you." She tilted her head slightly. "For what?" "For teaching me how to see again." He hesitated, then added quietly, "The Corps teaches us how to fight. You taught us why. There's a difference." Eva studied him for a moment, and for the first time since she'd met him, she smiled, small, genuine, fleeting. "You learned it yourself," she said. He shook his head. "Maybe, but it started with you." There was a long pause, one of those silences that means more than words. Then she offered her hand. Sullivan hesitated, then shook it firmly. "No rank, no ego, just mutual respect." "Take care of the cauldron," she said. "I will." "And teach them what matters." "I will," he repeated. She gave a faint nod, slung the duffel over her shoulder, and stepped past him. As she walked down the hall, her boots echoing on polished concrete, Sullivan watched her go. He realized something profound, that he would probably never see her again, and yet, her presence would never leave this place. The next morning, Sullivan stood before a new platoon. Fresh recruits, nervous faces, unscuffed boots. He looked at them for a long moment before speaking. "Welcome to the cauldron," he began. "You'll learn how to fight, how to survive, but before any of that, you'll learn what respect looks like." He paused, letting the silence hang. "Some months ago, right here, I made a mistake, a big one. I saw a uniform that wasn't mine. I saw a person who didn't fit my idea of what a warrior looked like, and I laughed." The recruits shifted uneasily. "I was wrong," he continued. "The person I laughed at, she humbled me, not with words, with truth." He turned, pointing toward the center of the mat. "Right there, that's where I learned that strength doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have a branch, it just is." He let the words settle into them, their young faces absorbing the weight. "And if you're lucky," he added quietly, "you'll learn it the easy way." A few of the older NCOs in the room nodded. They'd heard the story, maybe even seen it. But for the new recruits, the idea was almost mythic. They glanced at the circle again, their imaginations filling with invisible echoes of that day. Sullivan smiled faintly. "Let's begin." Over the following weeks, something shifted across Quantico. You could feel it in the rhythm of training, in the way instructors spoke, in the way Marines carried themselves. The air of competition softened into something sharper, awareness. Rivalry turned into collaboration. Jokes about other branches faded. The phrase, Restova's circle, became part of base vocabulary, a story told to remind them that every warrior, no matter how quiet, had earned their place. And within that quiet revolution, Sullivan found purpose again. He trained harder, taught differently. His pride no longer came from dominance but from transformation. Sometimes, late at night, he stayed behind after lights out, staring at that circle under the dim training hall lights. It was strange, he thought, how a single moment, a single person, could change the entire culture of a place. But that was the thing about real power. It never shouts. It resonates. Far from Quantico, Captain Eva Ristova sat alone in a windowless operations room, eyes reflecting the cold blue of a monitor. Streams of code scrolled across her screen, digital battlefields, invisible enemies. But sometimes, between keystrokes, her mind would drift. She'd see the cauldron again, the smell of mats, the sting of sweat, the echo of a salute. And she'd remember 10 men on the floor, gasping for air, not from pain but from awakening. It wasn't victory she remembered. It was the silence that followed. That rare silence that only comes when understanding finally replaces noise. That, she thought, is the sound of respect being born. What happens to a legend once the person behind it is gone? For most, it fades, exaggerated, embellished, and eventually forgotten. But not this one. At Quantico, it grew. It lived in whispered retellings across classrooms, in barracks after lights out, and in the respectful quiet that fell whenever a new recruit stepped into the cauldron. The story no longer needed names. It had become a parable. Some said she was still there, a ghost who appeared in reflections on the mat. Others said the instructors had banned laughter during warm-up drills out of respect. None of it was true, but truth had stopped mattering. The legend of Captain Eva Ristova had become something greater than any fact. Weeks passed, the cauldron changed. The energy was different now, sharper, calmer, aware. Marines no longer joked about who came from what branch. They listened to one another. They moved with more thought, more discipline. Gunnery Sullivan enforced it without needing to shout. When someone started to get cocky, he'd simply rest his palm on that faded patch in the middle of the mat, Restova's circle. It had become sacred ground. "You know what happened here?" he'd ask. Most recruits nodded, though none of them had been there. They didn't need to be. The walls carried the memory. One humid night, after the last lights went out, Sullivan sat alone on the mat. The hum of the fluorescent fixtures above was the only sound. His knuckles were bruised, his breathing steady. He stared at the circle, his reflection faint in the polished vinyl surface. He'd spent 20 years teaching people how to break things, bones, barriers, enemies. But what she'd taught him was how to build something instead. Perspective, awareness, respect. He whispered her name under his breath, not as a prayer, but as a kind of gratitude. Far away, inside an operations center buried beneath a steel complex, Eva sat under the pale light of her monitors. Rows of code flickered across her screens, traces of an intrusion attempt from a hostile network halfway around the world. Her hands moved swiftly over the keyboard, directing countermeasures, rerouting firewalls, analyzing data. Her face was calm, eyes steady behind the same thin glasses she'd worn in the cauldron, the same patience, the same silence. Her team around her didn't know the full story, only fragments. That she'd done something impressive at Quantico, that the Marines still talked about her, but they didn't ask. They had work to do. "Threat vector isolated," one of her analysts said. "Redirect and monitor," Eva replied softly. "Don't retaliate yet." She leaned back, watching the code pulse like a heartbeat. To anyone else, it was just data. To her, it was movement, rhythm like the flow of a fight. Different battlefield, same principles. Later that night, she stood outside the compound, breathing in the cold, metallic air. The desert stars stretched endlessly overhead, unblinking. She closed her eyes and listened not to the wind, but to silence itself. She thought about the Marines, about Sullivan, about how change spreads quietly, like ripples across still water. She had walked into that hall a stranger and left as something else, not a hero, not even a teacher, just a reminder that dignity and strength can speak without noise. The memory didn't fill her with pride, it filled her with peace. Back at Quantico, months turned into seasons. The story of Rostova's circle made its way into official briefings, then training manuals, then officer school lectures. A case study titled Cross-Discipline Competence and Cognitive Bias in Combat Readiness. They analyzed it in classrooms now, the psychology of perception, the fallacy of assumption. Professors quoted it, instructors cited it, but none of the paperwork captured the real lesson. It wasn't about martial arts, it was about humility. One afternoon, a young lieutenant lingered after a lecture and asked Sullivan quietly, "Sir, did she really take down 10 Marines by herself?" Sullivan smiled faintly. "You're missing the point, Lieutenant." He paused, eyes drifting toward the window. "She didn't defeat anyone, she revealed them." The young officer frowned. "Revealed what?" "Who they were," he said simply, "and who they could be." Years later, on a clear autumn morning, a convoy rolled through the base. Sullivan, older now, his hair silvered at the edges, stood outside the cauldron watching. The convoy carried recruits, the next generation. None of them had been born when the legend was made. And yet, as they entered the hall for orientation, they grew silent when they saw the circle. No one told them to, they just knew. The mark on the mat had long since faded, but the respect remained. Sullivan's assistant approached. "Gunny, they're ready." He nodded. "Good, let's begin." When he stepped onto the mat, the recruits straightened instinctively. "This place has history," he began. "Most of you don't know it yet. You will." He walked slowly, measured, his voice steady. "Once, someone came here who wasn't supposed to fit in. She didn't look the part, didn't sound the part. But she taught this room, taught me, that what you see isn't what defines someone. It's what you can't see that matters." He stopped at the center and looked down. "This circle right here, it isn't a mark of defeat. It's a reminder." He let the quiet stretch. The recruits listened, motionless. "Strength," he said, "isn't noise, it's focus, it's respect. It's knowing when not to hit back." Then he smiled slightly. "Remember that, it'll save your life." When the recruits left that day, one of them stayed behind, a young woman, barely 20, with hair tied back in a precise knot. She approached Sullivan as he packed up the training gear. "Sorry." He looked up. "Yeah." "Is the story true?" she asked. "About the Air Force captain?" Sullivan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It's true," he said quietly, "and it'll stay true as long as we keep learning from it." The young woman hesitated. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Sullivan smiled, the kind of smile that carries both pride and loss. "She never left," he said. That night in the empty cauldron, a faint breeze stirred through the open windows. The banners on the wall rustled softly, and the moonlight traced a silver outline across the mat. For a moment, just a breath, it almost looked like a figure standing there, calm and still, watching. But maybe it was just the light. Or maybe legends don't disappear. They simply blend into the silence they leave behind. Because sometimes, the greatest voices aren't the ones that shout their victories. They're the ones that teach others how to listen. Legends have weight. The longer they live, the heavier they become. By the time spring came, Rostova's name was no longer just a whisper. It had become a standard, something instructors invoked when arrogance started to surface. The story spread beyond Quantico, carried through joint briefings and inter-service programs, picked up by commanders who used it to make a point about perception, adaptability, and the evolution of war. But while others turned her lesson into myth, for the few who'd actually been there, it was never about spectacle. It was about the quiet truth that competence needed no audience. And for Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, that truth had become a way of life. He changed everything about how he trained. There were fewer shouts now, more reflection. Instead of pushing his Marines to exhaustion, he taught them to read the room, to sense the rhythm of each fight, to find the gap between attack and defense. He told them that hesitation could be a teacher, that fear could sharpen awareness instead of dulling it. Sometimes he would stand in front of his class, arms crossed, gaze distant. "You think combat is just about speed," he'd say, "but the fastest thing on any battlefield is ignorance." Then he'd step onto the mat, motion for a volunteer, and demonstrate exactly what she had shown him: how to redirect, how to let an opponent's strength work against them. The room would grow still. The young Marines would watch the flow, the minimal motion, the absolute efficiency. When it was over, Sullivan would step back, breathing calmly, and say, "Captain Rostova taught me that." No one dared to laugh, they only nodded. Instructors from other branches began visiting the cauldron. Airmen, Navy officers, even a few civilian defense analysts. They came to see the new approach, the one that merged mental agility with physical control. One of them, a British exchange officer, remarked after a session, "It feels less like a fight, more like a conversation." Sullivan smiled. "That's exactly what she said. Combat is a dialogue. If you stop listening, you lose." He'd written that quote on a small piece of paper and taped it inside his locker door. Every morning before training, he read it once, a ritual of focus. Meanwhile, far from Quantico, Captain Eva Rostova was buried deep in Operation Chimera. Her life had slipped back into the shadows, encrypted comms, secured briefings, missions that didn't make headlines. The physical battlefield had given way to an invisible one. One night during a long cyber defense simulation, an Air Force colonel leaned over her shoulder and said, "You were at Quantico last year, weren't you? The Rostova Circle story, that's you." Eva didn't look up. "It's exaggerated," she murmured. "Maybe," he said, "but it made people rethink the definition of soldier. That's no small thing." She didn't answer. When he walked away, she let her fingers rest on the keyboard, the faint glow reflecting in her glasses. Her expression was unreadable, a flicker of something between humility and distance. She didn't care for recognition, she cared for results. Back at Quantico, Sullivan received a package in the mail. No return address, just his name written in careful, even handwriting. Inside was a small wooden box. He opened it to find a single item, a thin, circular patch. The design was simple, a faint spiral etched in silver thread, surrounded by 3 words: "Observe, adapt, respect." No note, no signature, but he knew who had sent it. He stood there for a long moment, the patch resting in his rough palm. Then he smiled, that quiet kind of smile that belongs to those who have finally learned something real. He had it framed and hung above the entrance to the cauldron. Every recruit who walked in would see it first. Months later, a new recruit, a young man from Arizona, stopped after training and asked, "Gunny, what's that patch mean?" Sullivan looked up at the frame. "It's a reminder," he said. "Observe so you understand before you act. Adapt because no plan survives first contact. Respect because that's what makes you worth following." The recruit nodded slowly. "Sir, is it true she defeated 10 Marines in seconds?" Sullivan's eyes softened. "She didn't defeat them," he said. "She educated them." He paused, then added, "And I was the first student." Late one evening, long after the recruits had gone, Sullivan sat on the edge of the mat, staring at the patch above the door. The hum of the lights filled the silence. He thought about how much had changed, not just in the cauldron but in himself. He no longer measured strength in bruises or scars, but in understanding. He started writing notes, reflections for his next class, lessons learned from her teachings. He wasn't a philosopher, but the words came naturally. He wrote, "Discipline is not control over others, it's control over self. Strength is quiet until needed. Leadership begins where pride ends." He closed the notebook, the weight of those truths pressing gently against his chest. Somewhere he hoped she knew, not the myth, not the legend, but the impact she had left behind. Far away, in a secure bunker, Eva sat before a monitor filled with cascading data streams. The hum of machines was the same rhythm she remembered from the cauldron, steady, alive, constant. A message appeared on her encrypted feed, internal correspondence from Quantico. Attached was a photo, Sullivan and his Marines standing beneath the framed patch. At the bottom, in small text, a note read, "The circle still stands." Eva stared at it for a long time. Then she reached for her coffee, took a slow sip, and whispered under her breath, "Good." The next day, she briefed a team on a new cyber threat vector, a potential breach into satellite infrastructure. Her tone was calm, deliberate. The same kind of control that once silenced a room full of skeptics now directed entire teams. Her voice carried quiet authority, not through volume, through conviction. When the briefing ended, one of her junior officers stayed behind. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to say the way you run things, it's different. You don't yell, you don't push, but people listen. They really listen." Eva looked at him, almost amused. "Do they?" He nodded earnestly, "Yes, ma'am." She gave a small smile. Then maybe we're finally learning the right language. He didn't understand the depth of that statement. Not yet, but he would. Because somewhere between the mats of Quantico and the circuits of cyber war, Captain Eva Rostova had changed more than a few lives. She had taught warriors that strength wasn't a roar. It was a whisper that carried. And as legends go, that one, she thought, was worth keeping alive. The invisible battlefield had rules of its own. No uniforms, no medals, no sound of boots striking concrete, only keystrokes and silence. Yet to Eva Rostova, it was all the same fight, the same rhythm, the same discipline that had once turned a room full of skeptics into believers now guided her through the quiet chaos of cyber warfare. The lines of code that pulsed across her screen weren't just numbers, they were motion, intention, attack and defense intertwined. Every firewall breached was a strike dodged. Every trace hidden was a counterattack. But tonight was different. The room felt heavier, the screens brighter. She leaned forward, studying the anomaly that had slipped through their network perimeter. It wasn't just a test or a simulation, it was real. Someone was probing their systems with precision, the kind that came from experience. "Ma'am," her second-in-command called from across the room, "we're getting intrusion attempts from multiple vectors, coordinated, adaptive." "Keep them contained," Eva said calmly. "Already trying. Whoever this is, they're good." She adjusted her glasses and typed a string of commands. "Then we'll have to be better." The hum of the servers grew louder, filling the silence with tension. Her team moved quickly, but Eva's focus narrowed. Her breathing slowed, her posture settling into that same quiet readiness that once stunned the Marines at Quantico. The screen flickered. Lines of data shifted, rearranging like a puzzle being solved in real time. Then she saw it, the pattern. "Redirect their signal through the dummy node," she said, "and isolate their source through reverse DNS reflection." Within seconds, the feed changed. A single IP string surfaced, location bouncing from Berlin to Riyadh to a small encrypted hub outside Bucharest. Her eyes sharpened. "Got you." It wasn't victory yet, but it was control. Hours later, when the operation concluded and the breach was neutralized, Eva sat alone in the dim glow of the monitors. The room had gone quiet, her team dismissed, the adrenaline fatting. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion seeping through her bones. Every battle, digital or physical, left a residue, not of fear but of awareness. She learned long ago that winning wasn't about domination. It was about comprehension, about knowing when to stop fighting and start understanding. Her hand brushed against the small USB drive that hung from a lanyard around her neck, a keepsake from Quantico. Not a medal, not a certificate, just a memory. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear the echo of boots, the thud of bodies hitting the mat, and Colonel Vance's voice cutting through the stunned silence. "State your name for the record." She smiled faintly. That moment felt like another lifetime. Meanwhile, back at Quantico, the cauldron was thriving. Sullivan's approach had spread beyond his platoon. Other instructors had adopted his methods, merging instinct with intellect. The Marine Corps martial arts program had quietly evolved, less rigid, more fluid. The new doctrine emphasized observation and adaptability. On the wall where the Rostova patch hung, someone had stenciled 3 words beneath it in clean, military lettering. Listen, learn, lead. Sullivan didn't know who had painted it. He didn't ask. Because it was right. Every time he entered the hall, he paused for a second at the door. The smell of sweat, resin, and iron filled his lungs, the smell of effort, of transformation. He'd close his eyes briefly and imagine her voice, calm and unshaken, explaining a technique. "Don't resist the force," she'd said once. "Redirect it, always redirect." Those words had changed more than his training. They changed his command. On one of those late afternoons, as the sun burned gold through the high windows, Sullivan finished a session with a new class of recruits. "All right, that's enough," he called. "Hydrate and hit the showers." As they filed out, one of the younger Marines, tall, restless, too eager, lingered. "Gunny." "Yeah. That story about her, it's true, right? You really saw it." Sullivan looked at him for a moment, a faint grin pulling at the edge of his mouth. "I didn't see it," he said softly. "I lived it." He turned toward the mat. "And you're standing where it happened." The recruit looked down at the circle, the surface worn smooth from years of training. He nodded once, quietly, then left. Sullivan stayed behind, lowering himself to the mat. He sat cross-legged, resting his hands on his knees, eyes fixed on the empty space before him. He wasn't praying, just remembering. The first laugh. The first fall. The first lesson that stripped him of everything he thought he knew. He whispered the words he'd never said aloud to her. "Thank you." That night, the wind moved through Quantico's narrow corridors, carrying the distant sound of cadence calls and the faint rumble of marching boots. Sullivan stood outside, hands tucked behind his back, watching the horizon fade. The stars came out slowly, blinking one by one. He wondered where she was, if she was safe, if she ever thought of this place again. Then he realized she didn't need to be here. She was in every quiet command, every respectful pause, every lesson that began with listening instead of shouting. Her influence didn't need her presence. It had already fused into their discipline. Thousands of miles away, in a classified facility deep beneath concrete and steel, Eva leaned back in her chair, closing another report. Her shift was over. She looked at the time, 02:17 hours. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a folded piece of paper, a photograph someone had sent months ago. Sullivan and his Marines, standing proudly beneath the framed patch. She traced the edge of the picture with her thumb. For a moment, the world outside the walls, the tension, the politics, the endless code faded away. It was just the mat, the silence, the faces of those who had once mocked her now standing taller because of her. She smiled. Then softly to herself, she said, "It was never about defeating them. It was about reminding them who they are." She slipped the photograph back into her pocket, turned off the lights, and stepped into the dark hallway, her footsteps steady, precise, familiar. Outside, the night was still. The stars watched silently as if they knew. Somewhere between Quantico and the unknown, a single truth continued to echo in every code written, every order given, every lesson passed on. True strength doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It doesn't prove. It simply endures. Every mission leaves a mark, not the kind people can see, but the kind that shapes how you move, how you breathe, how you trust silence. For Captain Eva Ristova, the months following Operation Chimera were just that. Silence wrapped around movement. Long hours in classified rooms, long flights between undisclosed locations. She had become a ghost in the system, the invisible hand correcting the balance of things. But even ghosts remember where they were born. Late one evening, in a debriefing facility in Nevada, she found herself surrounded by a small group of younger officers. They were fresh, ambitious, eyes lit by screens and idealism. One of them, a cyber lieutenant named Hayes, asked the question carefully, as if testing the waters. "Ma'am, is it true what they say, that you trained at Quantico, that you took on Marines?" Eva looked up from her report. There was no pride in her eyes, only patience. "Stories grow," she said softly. "Yes, ma'am," Hayes replied quickly. "It's just, well, the lessons everywhere. They even talk about it at Air Command now. They call it the Circle Doctrine." Eva blinked once. The name hit her in an unexpected place, somewhere between surprise and quiet amusement. "The Circle Doctrine," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am, observe, adapt, respect. They say it started with you." She closed the folder and set her pen aside. "It didn't start with me," she said. "It started with the need to listen." Hayes nodded, though she could tell he didn't fully understand. Few ever did until they learned it the hard way. "Ma'am," he asked hesitantly, "do you ever miss the physical side of it, the fight?" Eva thought about the cauldron, about the way the mats had sounded when bodies hit them, the way silence had followed her every motion. "No," she said, "I never fought to win, I fought to teach." And that was the truth. Back in Virginia, Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan stood at the edge of the training floor, watching a group of Marines move through a sparring sequence. Their precision impressed him, clean transitions, measured force, complete control. He saw no wasted movement, no ego. "Reset at the circle," he shouted. They obeyed instantly, returning to the center of the mat. He smiled faintly. The phrase had once been an order, now it was an institution. Colonel Vance, older, slower, but still sharp, entered quietly from the doorway, arms crossed. "Looks different in here," he said. Sullivan nodded. "Feels different too." Vance stepped onto the mat beside him. "You did well, Gunny. You took a humiliation and turned it into doctrine." Sullivan let out a low breath. "I just kept her lesson alive, sir." "Sometimes that's the hardest thing," Vance said, his tone reflective. "Keeping a lesson alive without turning it into worship." Sullivan chuckled. "No danger of that. She wouldn't have tolerated worship." They both knew it was true. Later that night, after the recruits were gone and the lights dimmed, Sullivan sat in his office, writing in his notebook, the same one he'd started years ago. Its pages were filled with reflections, quotes, lessons rewritten in his own words. He paused at the last page, unsure what to add next. Then slowly he wrote, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what keeps moving when you stop pushing." He stared at it for a long while. Then, almost unconsciously, he glanced toward the photo pinned above his desk. His platoon standing beneath the framed patch, the faint spiral gleaming under fluorescent light. He whispered, "Still teaching, Captain." Elsewhere on the other side of the world, A satellite feed flickered on in a command center. Dozens of encrypted data points began streaming across a large display. Eva stood before it, calm as always. Her team was silent, waiting for direction. "Priority intercept," she said. "No aggressive tracebacks until I say, we're not here to win a game of chess. We're here to understand it." Her analysts nodded and went to work. In the glow of monitors, her reflection merged with the data. She looked almost weightless, a part of the machine itself. For a fleeting moment, she thought of Sullivan again, of the way his voice had carried when he'd barked her name across that mat, of the disbelief that turned into awe. She wondered if they'd all truly learned it, that balance between intelligence and humility. She hoped they had. Later, alone in her quarters, she took out a small flash drive from a steel drawer, the one she carried from base to base. She connected it to her terminal, and an image appeared. The cauldron, empty, sunlight spilling through the barred windows. She'd taken it on her last day, quietly, before leaving the base. It wasn't nostalgia that brought her back to it. It was the reminder of silence, of calm before action. She zoomed in on the faint circle in the mat, still visible even through the years. Her expression softened. Every scar tells a story, she thought. But not every story needs to be retold. Outside, dawn broke slowly, painting the horizon in pale light. Somewhere far away, recruits were training. Somewhere else, instructors were quoting her without even realizing it. And somewhere, perhaps right then, a young officer was standing in front of a team saying, "Observe, adapt, respect." Eva closed the laptop. She whispered the last words of her father, the ones that had carried her through every battle, every room filled with doubt. "Silence is not weakness, it's readiness." Then she straightened her uniform, clipped her badge, and walked out to meet another day, another fight that would never make the headlines but would still matter. Because legacy, she knew, wasn't about being remembered. It was about making others remember why they serve. Some stories end quietly. Others never end at all. They just fade into the rhythm of those who carry them forward. Years passed. Bases changed. Names rotated through rosters and records, but one phrase endured through every generation that followed: the circle. It lived not on paper, but in the way Marines moved, deliberate, precise, aware. It lived in the moments of silence before sparring began, when every new recruit stood on the mat and understood that arrogance was not allowed here. Only awareness. Captain Eva Rostova never returned to Quantico. Her life had become a series of deployments she could never speak of, places without coordinates, missions without names. She moved between data centers, field bases, and command rooms, leaving no trace except results. The higher she rose, the quieter her influence became. And yet, every now and then, something would reach her. A message, a photograph, a story whispered between teams that had never met her but spoke of her as if she were part of the air they breathed. They called it Rostova's principle now, a term used in tactical leadership training. It appeared in manuals and lectures under cognitive adaptability. But the people who taught it didn't know its origin. They didn't need to. Because true legacy doesn't need authorship. One evening, in a small operations post overseas, Eva walked through a temporary command tent lit by red emergency bulbs. The air smelled of dust and diesel. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the desert. Her team worked quietly, managing satellite relays. They were young, most of them too young to remember the old days of direct engagement. To them, war was a digital labyrinth, not a battlefield of mud and noise. And yet their focus reminded her of the cauldron, of discipline carved from chaos. "Ma'am," one of them said suddenly, looking up from his console, "there's an encrypted transmission for you. It's marked personal." Eva raised an eyebrow. "From who?" "Unclear. Looks routed through Quantico, ma'am." For a moment she froze, then she nodded. "Patch it through." The screen blinked, stabilizing into a simple message, text only. The circle still stands. Thought you should know. G.S. Sullivan. Her lips parted just slightly. Not a smile, not exactly. Something deeper. She leaned back, the faintest shimmer of emotion crossing her composed features. The hum of the machine seemed to fade, replaced by a memory of scuffed mats and echoing laughter that had died too soon. She closed her eyes and whispered, barely audible, good. Back at Quantico, Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan was older now. The lines on his face carried both pride and penance. His movements were slower, but his command was stronger than ever. That day he stood before another group of recruits, new faces, new energy. He watched them with calm authority as they spread out across the mat. "Before we begin," he said, "there's something you need to understand." He gestured toward the faded circle in the center. "This spot here, this is where the Corps learned a lesson that changed everything. We call it the circle, but it's not about combat, it's about humility." He paused, scanning the young faces before him. Every person you meet knows something you don't. Every opponent, every ally, every stranger. Respect that truth, and you'll never be blindsided by arrogance. The recruits nodded, silent. "All right," Sullivan said finally, "show me what you've learned." As they began their drills, he stepped back, arms folded, listening to the rhythm of their movements. It was the same rhythm he'd once failed to hear, the rhythm she had brought with her. That evening, when the base went still, he sat alone on the mat, knees bent, notebook open. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote his final entry. "The greatest warriors I've known never needed to be loud. They changed the room by walking into it. They taught by example. They listened before they acted. And when they were gone, the silence they left behind was louder than any shout." He closed the notebook, resting his palm against the worn cover. Then in the quiet he said her name once, softly like a salute. Thousands of miles away, under a foreign sky, Eva stood on a rooftop as dawn crept over the horizon. She watched the sun rise, slow, deliberate, spilling light over a landscape that had never seen peace for long. Her radio crackled softly behind her, updates coming in about a successful operation. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The world kept moving. The mission kept changing. But for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself the luxury of stillness. She remembered the sound of laughter, the weight of silence, the way respect could reshape an entire culture without a single word. And in that moment, she understood something she never had before. It had never been about proving herself. It had been about showing others the quiet path toward understanding. Sometimes victory wasn't in dominance, it was in restraint. Sometimes dignity didn't need applause, it needed witnesses. And sometimes, the greatest impact came from those who left quietly, trusting others to carry the light forward. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in gold, she whispered the words that had become the silent creed of everyone she'd touched. Observe, adapt, respect. Then she turned away, disappearing into the hum of the waking base. Another day, another mission, another reminder that legends don't end when people stop speaking their names. They live on in every act of quiet strength. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.